Hello, everyone. Before we begin tonight's episode, I want to issue a quick viewer discretion is advised warning for everyone involved because tonight's episode will be focusing on the ever mercurial, bizarre, and infinitely horny Tom Driberg, whose biographies and autobiographies that we draw upon for this episode are notoriously indiscreet. So if you are in the company of children or otherwise those sensitive to such things, please be advised because we're going to get into some very silly territory today. And for those of you who are sticking around, feel free to join us in our adventures of espionage, scrying the occult, and redefining what it means to be out and proud. Happy Pride, everyone.
Be not alarmed at the frightful howls which you may hear. It's Salt's finger, and hosting today it's your boy, your brethren, Bromansky.
Romansky.
Bromansky. Oh my.
Happy Pride.
Yeah, happy Pride, everyone.
It's June.
Mm-hmm.
And we're doing a very silly episode, all thanks to the genius of Key having brought this insane character to our attention, because I honestly haven't. The first time I heard of Tom Driberg was because you sent me an image of him. Like, it's the one that comes up when you Google him. And you were like, scry this guy. And no warning, no context, like no why, like no, like, oh, this guy was, whatever. Like, have a look at him. And I remember asking you, like, was he a journalist? And you were like, yeah. And I was like, was he like a politician? And you were like, yeah. And I was like, was he like, I didn't quite get spy, but I said, like, was he like really involved in like lots of different like governmental activities and stuff like that? And you were like, yeah. And then I was like, he's very horny. And you were like, yeah. And then when you told me who he was, I was like, why? How is this person known to everybody and everyone? Like, you were the one who came up with the idea, like the episode title being 6 Degrees of Tom Driberg. This guy is better than Kevin Bacon. Like, everybody knew him, and yet I've never heard of him until you dropped him into our DMs and were like, look upon him with your witch gaze. I think I'm still wiping my eyes, spirit eyes, clean with bleach of what I have seen.
Yeah, he was the frightful howls that one is informed to be afraid of when in the circle. If you will.
Literally.
Because he lived a life of notable excess to the degree that at his own funeral he asked not his virtues to be extolled, but his sins to be expounded upon publicly.
That's kind of bold for some guy's Anglican as he was.
Oh yeah. I was like, wow, that's very Protestant of you. Very nice.
Very nice. And it just so happened, I think that recording it, it wasn't intended to be, but he kind of is our Pride Month special. It's funny, we almost recorded this as episode 3 originally. And it just so happened that Salt was not available at the time. He was on a secret mission, doing his sorcery. And we were like, oh, it kind of sucks that it would just be the two of us. But I mean, Salt is the resident, heterosexual man of the three of us. So perhaps, it was meant to be. But no, I'm glad you're here with us because, my love, we need your voice for some of these quotes. It is a must. Some of these must be read in a British accent, and I don't trust myself or Key to do them justice.
Well, I mean, it's really important to get Driberg's mother right. So
Yes, we need you to be Driberg's mom,
For real.
who was a freaking queen, honestly, and not not in
Mhm.
the way that you might think, given what we've said about him.
Oh yeah, we will definitely be getting into her
Mhm.
pseudo sorceress antics soon enough.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I have to ask, why Driver? I mean, I know why, because you sent him to me and we're like, scry him. But so far, on the podcast, we've been covering, matters of folklore, matters of witchcraft, exorcism, and so on. And this is an early episode out of like the whole catalog of ones that we've already pre-written and pre-drafted. I mean, and by written, I just mean like, the research notes, right? Because obviously we
Yeah.
record these just as we are. And we could have done if you wanted to do a profile on a person, we could have picked any number of occultists and witches in history, people who had like, very explicitly magical lives. And Driberg's life was, as we'll see, is touched greatly by the occult, and he was surrounded by occultists. He was a friend of Aleister Crowley's and known to many other occultists and stuff like that. But he is not explicitly like, as much of a sorcerer, or even necessarily one himself to the degree that people in his life were. So I'm curious, given that we've kind of, started us off pretty strongly with like these kind of like folkloric deep dives, like why him? Because I know your answer, I know it's great, but I want everyone else to hear them. Why are we talking about Tom Driberg other than that he was the baddest bitch who lived in his time period?
Yeah, so that is one of the major points, is he is one of the baddest bitches who lived in his time period. And
Certified.
Yeah. So as, sorcerers, it is in part our duty to go about raising the dead and calling upon them for our own purposes. And this is a figure who lived a folklorically extravagant life. To say that he lived a life well indulged in all of his interests, all of his habits, anything he could possibly do, he did to the fullest extent. And that is immediately good materia. He was surrounded by occultists and the occult his entire life, even meeting Aleister Crowley at multiple different points and rebuffing his notoriously bisexual advances for how much of a top that Tom Driberg was.
Yeah, that's kind of shocking, but at the same time, knowing what we know about Crowley, not so shocking.
Yeah, so knowing what we know about Crowley and knowing what we know about Driberg, we would expect them to have hooked up. They did not, because Driberg BTFO'd Crowley about magic, saying that high Anglican Mass was more effective than the Lemmic ritual, which is pretty base. Which we'll get into. But really the main point about Driberg is he is just this fascinating figure that had so many brushes with magic, with ritual, with the occult, with every celebrity under the sun, with power, with politic, with a well-lived and well-indulged sex life, which we'll get into. He just seemed like the perfect subject of, the burgeoning necromancer to be relatively interested in.
Yeah, like who wouldn't want his grave dirt? Like, let's be real. In terms of like, I've read a little bit into him just to be prepared to have things to say in response to your research, and I was struck by how many, his biographers as well as his commentators have just noted that, he is a mess of contradictions, and he loved all of them. He, went to the fullest extent possible, as you're about to, explain for us, into being everything that he was to extreme sincerity and indulgence, even when it confused other people. And I think there's something about that to being a magician, It's like, yes, I had people stare at me when I'm gathering dirt at a crossroad or by, you know, other places, and probably look at like, what is that young woman doing? You know, she's a little too put together to be doing whatever she's doing right there with a little $1 spade, you know, that she has in her bag and her Sharpie and her everything. And I just make eye contact back, and I'm like, what? You know, just what? And when I feel, you know, when I think about the times that I hold myself back, you know, from pursuing my interests, diverse as they are with abandon, I'm gonna think about that one picture you sent me of Tom Driberg and be like, do it for him.
So yeah, that is really the reason why we're getting into Tom Driberg today, is because he lived an unapologetic life and a very fulfilled life. And I think that is something that, as you know, time goes on, when noticing trends in occultism and magic that's made more public, people are, you know, reining themselves in.
Mm.
And this is a reminder to,
well, your freak fry, you know.
yeah, oh yeah.
You sent me a message being like, this guy was my like dom top ancestor, and I was just like, listen, I believe in you, I love you, and you can be anything that you want to be, Key. And Tom Driberg is smiling upon you from Anglican heaven, giving you the thumbs up.
Yeah, I'm like sitting at my, you know, shrine where I call the dead, being like, Mr. Driberg, I would like to be a certified freak. And he's like, say no more, I got you. One of the main things, though, that I want to get into more than that is to try to answer the question a little more holistically than others have in the past with their own articles, their own biography, of who the fuck is Tom Driver? Because my pitch of this character, of this individual in history, in this uniquely you know, contradictory and bacchanalian and mercurial figure, is that to say he's a poet, a communist organizer, a gossip columnist, a journalist, a leftist MP who served in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords in England, the former chairman of the UK's Labour Party, an occult bookseller, an alleged spy, or perhaps informant, or double, or even triple, depending on what author you read and what source you research, informant for MI5 and the KGB, and all around, you know, bacchanalian socialite, indulging in sexual and other forms of excess at all times, who is remembered popularly for his brazen homosexual antics and mind-boggling ability to avoid any consequences for any of the aforementioned things at a time where they were all super illegal, would technically be correct. He was a figure of infinite contradiction and infinite indulgence. And I think both of those are very interesting avenues to explore as, you know, witches and magicians who are constantly indulging in this give and take of contradiction, indulgence, and power in general.
Mm-hmm.
This episode is going to feature an equally diverse cast of characters as his resume that sound like they come from an occult political filler that someone posted on Archive of Our Own as like a pure fanfic, because we have Aleister Crowley, Winston Churchill, Nikita Khrushchev, the Cray brothers, and Lord Boothby together as, you know, a criminal racket in England, Mick Jagger, Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, Pope Pius XII, known for his Nazi affiliations, the author Edith Stilwell, Guy Burgess, Maxwell Knight, who is a certified freak and someone who will likely be the subject of his own episode, alongside the likes of Michael Aquino and the Temple of Set.
And isn't there like a really funny story about Mick Jagger or something?
Yeah, so just to give a titillation, if you will, of the sexual antics of Tom Driberg is that he met with Mick Jagger at an authors and actors dinner of sorts, a gala. And one of his contemporaries who attended said, I was enthralled by the arousing directness of Tom Driberg, who sat next to Mick Jagger, looked him in the eye, and remarked at the size of the bulge in his pants and said he would like to give him fellatio there and then.
And
With
did he?
no hesitation. He didn't, according to the guy, but I'm like, he fucking had to have at least given him the eyes.
He gave him like the like a tabletop role playing game, like charisma check.
Roll to seduce.
Roll to seduce, yeah. That takes balls to just like stare at him straight in the eyes and is just like, you want head? It's like a weird grinder come on.
Yeah, exactly. And his biographer at the time was like, no wonder this guy has a fucking beautiful sex life. It had to have worked at some point.
At some point, oh yeah.
So, to digress, because of all this insanity of his life, with all this cast of characters, all of these, titles and aspects and roles that he has played with great vigor throughout his life, it's probably the easiest to approach his biography in a roughly chronological order, which is consisting of sometimes contemporaneous arcs of, if he's working a particular job while also blowing dock workers constantly at the time. It's a whole thing that we'll get into. So, Act 1, if you will, I like to call The Portrait of a Young Man at Oxford. Because Tom Driberg was born in 1905 in Crowborough, which is a quick jaunt south of London. And the one thing he says in his autobiography, which will serve as the main source of this episode, and I want to get into the caveat there of, this is of course an autobiography. There are some glaring omissions, which we will cover later. Take it with a grain of salt, but it is deliciously lurid and has one of the best titles for a posthumously published set of memoirs that I've ever seen, which is Ruling Passions.
Ruling Passions.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his famous biographies, might I add, by Francis Wheen, has a phenomenal title as well, The Soul of Indiscretion. Yes. Tom Driberg, poet, philanderer, legislator, and outlaw. Is The Soul of Indiscretion phenomenal.
Mm-hmm. Both of which I read for this episode, and both of which are beautiful sources that I highly recommend to the listeners. So he was born in Crowborough, and the one thing that I took away from all of his biographies and articles written about his life is that he fucking hated it. He was miserable there. He had two older brothers who were almost 20 years his senior, and his father passed away when he was very young. Before he turned 10 years old. Dad's out of the picture. Both of his brothers have moved out. Both of whom also were suffering from pretty serious PTSD, among other mental illnesses, after the First World War. And it was a whole thing that led to his bookishness and isolation as a child. So he had some solace when he went to a boys' school in Crowborough, where he learned three things, and this is by his own admission, which is, number one, that he was in love with the high ritual of the Anglican Church, which would inform his flirtations with magic and mysticism for the rest of his life. He was compelled by Anglo-Catholicism, smells and bells, as it's called in England, obsessed. The second is that he would become a leftist organizer, in becoming involved with, communist and socialist movements, the Communist Party of Great Britain, for the rest of his life, which would inform his politic and his professional career. And the third thing is that he was super gay, like super unapologetically, compulsively gay. Which would inform both of the above in increasingly mercurial ways throughout his life. In Ruling Passions, the autobiography that we mentioned before, he states that he experimented extensively with other boys at the school. And these three things, these three motifs, are the lenses through which all of his life decisions, until he died and even posthumously, can be understood to some extent and will be invoked time and time again throughout this episode. Because as contradictory as they may sound at first glance, he embraced all three of them and perfectly reconciled them within himself, which makes him,
honestly.
and for real,
Mhm.
and it makes him one of the more fascinating, gay ancestors, as it were, for those who are inclined to work with those spirits, who are able to, mediate the insanity of that life, having, been there, done that, with, calls for purity and ritual and professional obligation that may be, against the life that one would wish to lead. And he navigated all of them expertly. More on that later when we get into the necromancy of Tom Driberg. So, fast forwarding to about 1918, when he would be about 13 years old, he fled the boys' school where he was miserable, but learning that these three motifs would inform his life, to Lansing College in Worthing, where he, at a very young age, joined an intellectual society called the Dilettanti, which would lead to his connections with a lot of writers, poets, homosexuals, kind of the, liberal intellectual elite of the time, that would inform his forays into poetry, into writing, into journalism, all of which will become important later. During this time, and through his dilettante connections, he joins the Communist Party of Great Britain and attained a lot of offices at the school as his organizational skills were honed through his communist connections, becoming the school librarian, the caretaker of the Anglican Church, and similar such roles within the student body, organizing student groups and the like. During this time, he, as the caretaker of the church, studied Catholic and Anglican ritual procedure extensively, going so far as to memorize the text of the liturgist Charles Walker's The Ritual Reason Why, which is a super technical examination of the protocol and the rituals used within the High Anglican Catholic Church, explaining why certain liturgies are said on certain days of the years or during certain ceremonies, why ritual garb is worn at different times, why certain numbers of candles are lit, why incense is burned, all of this, which, is a good technical manual actually for occultists to read, in my opinion, having, gone through this text, because I'm like, oh, cool, there are like actual magic practicum in this book.
Mhm.
To, surreptitiously exploit the ritual structure and power of the mass in the church.
I was gonna say the Book of Common Prayer as well, right? Like genuinely wonderful little handbooks for that kind of thing.
Definitely, yeah. At this time, he was becoming versed in the Book of Common Prayer. He was becoming versed in, the King James Bible, going through all these different texts, all these different liturgies. He also cites Walter Walsh's The Secret History of the Oxford Movement as being the most influential book in his life at the time of writing his biography, in his late 60s, early 70s, which, much as, to draw the parallel the Malleus Maleficarum does for magic and witchcraft, this particular text, The Secret History, does an amazing job in its criticism of the Oxford movement, which describes all of its practices and ensures that they are codified in a textual way that can be studied and expounded upon later. So one of the things about this period is he understood it all through those three aforementioned lenses, as Saul will read here.
No, I was leading a triple life indeed. I had to conceal from my new comrades both the fact that I was being educated at bourgeoisie public school, and still more, my ecclesiastical and sexual tastes. In its turn, the school must know nothing of the sex or the party. Only Father Gurdon was mildly amused to find that I was distributing a red sheet without success in its parish. Through the party, I was at last able to meet on terms of equality, better still, inferiority, since they had been in the party longer than I, males of the working class.
Wow.
Yeah. So he, as we'll later come to understand, had very complicated emotions about who he was hooking up with along class struggle lines due to his communist predilections, as well as his, Oxford bourgeois ties. So he, of course, is leading that triple life. During his time at Lansing, he's honing his craft as a poet, a journalist, and a homosexual, hooking up repeatedly with everyone, which unfortunately and sadly leads to his pseudo expulsion from Lansing in 1923 when he would be about 18 years old, when two other boys that he tried to hook up with complained that he was way too promiscuous from all the accounts that I've seen writing. Not that he tried to hook up with them, not that he successfully hooked up with them, but that he was hooking up with too many other guys.
It sounds like they were jealous.
Oh, yeah. So one of the interesting things that is the preeminent instantiation of the insane luck that he has throughout his life is that his expulsion was covered up by the headmaster of the school under the pretense that he needed private tutelage to get into Oxford. So he was protected. He was hidden as, a homosexual. He was not outed by those who would seek to out him, which is really interesting and goes into, some of these sorcerer's applications that we're starting to kick the snowball down the hill for it to accumulate more and more uses. So one of the interesting things is in a, kind of the mind-boggling move for 1923 in a conservative religious boys' school is that the headmaster's stated reason was for, protecting Driberg was to hide that he was gay from his mom.
Wow.
To not out him to his family, which, cool shit. Shout out to the headmaster. And shout out to Driberg's mom. I would like to take the aside to talk about her because she's a fucking queen. So after her husband, so Tom's dad's death in 1919, she took to beekeeping, of all things, with what Tom and her neighbors described as a passionate intensity. She became the president of the local apiculturist association. She published academically her techniques in papers and even more technical writing in trade journals, herself developing a protocol to introduce new queens into a hive that is actually still used in England to this day. She had a substantial apiary installed at the family estate, which led to her installing as well an observation hive on her bedroom window, which she kept diligently until her death from leukemia. So for many, many, many years, she would lay in her bed watching the bees at work. And she was noted for her adherence to the tradition of telling the bees, saying everything, no matter how minute that transpired in her life, to the queen and the workers of the hive. During my research about this part of her life, I found a cool piece of lore when researching that was actually collected in the Sussex Archaeological Collection relating to the history and antiquity of the county in 1871 near the estate, which is as follows.
If you would wish your bees to thrive, gold must be paid for every hive. For when they're bought with other money, there will be neither swarm nor honey.
And she was stated by Driberg to actually follow this tradition. She never bought any of her own bees. They were given to her. Or if she did buy them, she did not use paper or coinage currency. She used gold ingots to pay for the queens and pay for the nukes that fueled her hive.
Telling the bees is like one of my favorite rural customs. Like we have it in the Balkans where I was born as well. And I distinctly remember as a child like being told to tell news not only to the house spirit, because it's, if a friend is coming over, let them know, and so on, like the spirits that live in your home and attend to it as a kind of like land wight, but also to the bees, especially in the farms. So this always makes me really happy. And I just found that really cool that she, took to this, after becoming a widow, and then developed onto it intellectually to the point that now we have this, this technique still being preserved.
Yeah, it's super cool that her, influence survives in Sussex of, a very major beekeeping practice of introducing queens as, parasitic diseases and bacterial infections become more and more common in hives with their declining resistance to such things over time. It's, she ensures to this day that the practice is kept. And, with regard to telling the bees, luckily that is a tradition that was passed on to me as well, even in, the Americas, with my, many of my relatives at this point being relatively commercially successful beekeepers who told me, tell them everything that happens and especially ensure that you tell them when someone dies. So speaking of death and the bees, after the death of Tom's mother, the house was requisitioned by the RAF as the war had just begun, and the hives were unfortunately destroyed by drunken soldiers who were posted there in an anti-air battery. After they were stung by the bees, they were said to have poured gasoline onto the hives and destroyed them utterly. However, after their destruction, Tom was on a bus in the local area and said that he overheard locals who were friends of his mom saying that she would appear near the remains of the apiary as a veiled woman dressed in black.
Oh my God.
Which is so base.
That is so base. Wow, what a spirit form to take as well, as like a mourning woman dressed in black with like a veil and everything. It's like the thing of just like, my husband's funeral, she rolls up in her pajamas, death of my hives, full suit.
Legit, yeah. She rolled up and was like, I'm just gonna keep telling the bees.
No kidding. And it becomes like a land spirit guardian of them as well. So that's to her. We should look into where we can get her dirt.
Definitely, yeah.
For our future plans of having bees ourselves.
So to return to Driberg after the aside, of course, as tends to be the case of, yeah, you're cool, but put your mom on the phone.
Literally, though.
He, in his seclusion at the boys' school, there are actually mixed accounts at this point. This is where some of the research diverged for me of how he handled this seclusion. Some said that he devoted himself very seriously to academics and decided to improve his life. Others said that he took very poorly to this isolation, in fact, developing some pretty serious mental health problems and attempting on 2 different occasions to take his own life. Luckily survived to tell the story that we're going to be telling you today, but that is where his biography diverges. My own personal opinion, having seen all the research, is that it was somewhere in the middle where he was pretty miserable, but kept up with his studies and eventually got into Christ Church at Oxford on a classic scholarship later in the year 1923, after he was pseudo expelled, but it was covered up, to study, English, writing, and religion. So when he got to Christ Church, he immediately linked up with a bunch of avant-garde artists, poets, but also the Communist Party, but also the Anglo-Catholic apparatus that was already at Oxford, and fervently involved himself with all of them.
Driberg's really like, I have 3 special interests. Bottom
For
text.
real.
Or top text, I suppose I should say.
Mm-hmm. Because, very, very much top.
You're like, I'll drink to that.
I will drink to that, literally.
What are you drinking right now?
Indian gin and tonic.
Mm.
So gin GG is the spirit, because Driberg's father was a Indian colonial official who brought back a lot of tantric artifacts to his house, to the point that he installed prayer wheels in every door that Driberg would spin throughout his life, and became very acclimated to lay Indian / Vedic / tantric spirituality in his youth, which, is my pet theory for why he was so acclimated to these later ideas about magic and ritual.
And his bizarre look.
Mm-hmm.
So what was he getting up to then once he got himself to Oxford?
So, being the gay, edgy 20-year-old that he was, much like myself at the time when I got to university, he became obsessed with modernist literature, especially T.S. Eliot, having distributed copies of The Wasteland to all of his friends and reading them together in extremely homoerotic sessions that he describes at great length in his autobiography. And he started writing poetry pretty extensively that was picked up by the university press and was published by Oxford in 1926 in an anthology of student poetry. He was going to, open mics, poetry readings. He was a, slam poet of much renown. And and he ran into Edith Stilwell, the very, famous poet and author, who I highly recommend. And he idolized her. He was like, she is the pinnacle of poetry in 1926 Anglophone writing. And he began to emulate her style. And as he did so, he had repeated freak and chance encounters with her at just random places. Like, they kept bumping into each other. And eventually, through their interactions, he convinced her to listen to some of his poetry, which she really fucking liked.
Huh.
And she began inviting him to salons that she would hold in her apartment with all these other, famous authors of the period. And he would show up in the room, be like, hey, I'm Tom Driberg, who's trying to fuck. And then these random other gay poets would be like, me. So he was sleeping with the literati elite of 1920s England at the time he was 20 years old, at the invitation of Edith Stilwell, and just moving through this whole scene. And she will actually come back later as a major saving grace in his life. And this kind of continues the streak of magical applications of him, is creating freak encounters with people who you need to meet, because throughout his entire life, he's marked by chance encounters that only benefited him.
It is like the godfather of luck drawing, like magic for the sake of bringing cool people to you, bringing chance encounters to you, enriching your life through uncommon connections. In our last Patreon Q&A, we talked about like how the three of us met, how Salt and I got together, how we started dating, how we met you, how we became best friends. And like that for me is like a Dribergian level like chance encounter with how like unlikely it was that the three of us met in any capacity that we did. But I would say that, not to tease the end of the episode where we talk about like magical applications of this man's life, like 100% it is the road openers to make more roads open for their own sake. It's to bring amazing connections in any aspect of your life, including things you've not done before. Like maybe you haven't studied an instrument that you're, but yeah, we find the person who's going to teach to you enter, a club that, or like a book club or something like that, that suddenly has the person that you connect with and obtain like a deep and nuanced appreciation for something. Like that is, to my understanding from what you told me, literally what his life was like, and to the point that other people commented that this guy is like obscenely lucky, and the whole time he's getting laid too, which good for him.
Yeah, he was extremely lucky, was marked by these chance encounters with the who's who of England throughout this period, and generally was considered someone who had a supernatural ability to have the exact life that he wanted and to avoid the consequences thereof, which is, as a magician, goals. So in the same period, he, to continue the streak of avoiding consequences, entered into what he refers to in his autobiography as the vacations period, which is a time marked by extensive travel internationally, both privately and with his mother, throughout which he was having a series of these chance encounters with important figures, in Spain, in France, in Italy, that would come to later inform his anti-fascist and communist ideologies, to further his journalistic career, which we'll get into in a bit, and to further his love life in an insane way. One of my favorite anecdotes from this period is actually from a trip to Italy that he took, which we'll read in full because any summary or brief rendition could not possibly do justice to the way that he phrased it.
I can almost forgive my mother for the well-meaning errors of my upbringing when I recall that she was responsible for my first experience of Italy and, unwittingly, for my first taste of Italian sex. I do not refer to the night porter at the hotel who seduced me late one night. It was not my fault, and he was rather too old, 35, for me, but he pounced with what some novelists call a strangled cry, and I felt that it would be ungenerous to rebuff the poor man. No, the best encounter of that holiday, or perhaps the second best, or as they say in some other sporting records, tied equal, was one which, surprisingly, punctuated and enriched a sedate walk one afternoon in my mother's company. We walked from Rapallo to Portofino Vetta, the sturdy, phallic lighthouse, which sticks up from the end of a graceful promontory. On the way, as we walked through a grove of pine trees, my mother slipped, probably on the pine needles, and fell.
Ah!
We're gonna keep that in. We're not gonna edit it out.
Oh my god!
I was like, I can't believe I'm making it this far to this quote without chuckling. Thank you so much, my love. All right. She was not at all seriously hurt, but when we reached the lighthouse, she decided to sit and rest outside while I climbed to the top. There were no other visitors. The lighthouse keeper was young, perhaps 25, and sensuously attractive. Not of the lean, dark Roman type of Italian, nor of the invitingly sinister Neapolitan or Sicilian types, almost more Austrian looking, with a round, tender face, plump but virile figure, fairish hair, and thick, mobile, smiling lips. We climbed the stairs. It was not at all a very tall lighthouse, but the lookout gallery that surrounded it was protected from snooping eyes by a chest-high barrier. We stood close together. He started to breathe heavily. I caught a whiff of garlic, and he looked straight into my eyes. Contact was instant. Consummation almost as quick. He had clearly not had sex for some days. Within 5 minutes or so, I had rejoined with my mother.
What a long time you were up there for, dear.
Well, it was a lovely view, mother. Naturally, I was sorry that she had fell, but I could hardly not be grateful for whatever tutelary deity, Priapus perhaps, had given her a push and led me up the lighthouse. Oh my god. I'm sorry that my mom fell, but thank you, whatever god helped me hook up with this guy for 5 minutes straight. Priapus, maybe? Garlic scented himbo. And such a such a that period of time way of describing I don't even know what to call it, like the phenotype of this gentleman. Oh my god. And by the way, you guys are missing out if you don't read his biography, because Key was sending us clips of it throughout researching this episode, and it's all written like this. This is his writing style.
Yeah, there are pseudo random interjections of him describing his political career, his life in, the House of Commons, and then being like, yeah, this other parliamentarian showed me the best cruising grounds in all of Parliament. There were rent boys constantly in this bathroom who I fucked extensively. And I'm like, what the fuck is going on here?
So thank you for the interjection as Driberg's mom. That is going to be a top 5 certified classic moment, I think.
No worries.
Yeah, also shoutouts to Driver for being like, yeah, I'm Anglo-Catholic, but shoutouts to Priapus for letting me hook up with this swarthy and garlic-smelling Italian lighthouse.
Oh god. I like, of course it's Priapus too, right? It's just I think perpetuating the trend of satyr worship.
Yeah. The unfortunately the fellow gays in the community and I are a little, we see a satyr and go, let me reblock that.
Yeah, it's true. Out of the 3 of us, you're the only one who had a Tumblr.
Yeah,
so
guilty as charged.
Yeah.
Guilty as charged is reblogging the horny pan images. And, it's an era. Every gay occultist goes through it.
What's Tumblr?
Oh god. We're gonna save that for another day.
Sounds like I'm learning so much.
Do you think Crowley would have had Tumblr?
Yes, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, are you kidding me? The Book of the Law would have been live channeled.
Yeah.
He would have literally begun every post with the 93s and everything.
Oh yeah. Some people do to this day.
So yeah, indeed, to this day.
So speaking of Crowley, during the vacations period in 1926, so only 3 years after the previous period of him being kind of edgy at Oxford, his poetry being published around the same time, Aleister Crowley, of all fucking people, caught wind of Driberg's antics at Oxford and found his poetry profoundly compelling, specifically because of an avant-garde performance that Driberg orchestrated called the Homage to Beethoven, where a group of undergraduates at the university kind of trolled the who's who of North Oxford and the extremely bourgeois donors to the university, the upperclassmen, the professors, by putting on a show that they advertised as, the Homage to Beethoven, celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the composer's death. But they got all these people into an auditorium that they booked out from the university, that they sold the higher ups, that they were like, we can put on this performance, we can put on this gala, we can bring in these donors, we can raise money for the university, we can get everyone donating, it'll be great. And they're like, yes, perfect. So they greenlit the whole fucking thing, gave Driberg specifically complete creative control. They fucked everyone over because Driberg along with one of his friends who was a composer at the time, who was very into avant-garde piano composition, decided that they would read Driberg's poetry and jest with the audience over a megaphone with a musical accompaniment of fragmented Stravinsky pieces played on a four-handed piano, a string section, multiple flutes, multiple clarinets, various pieces of percussion, two typewriters, and a toilet that was positioned just off stage that would be flushed at the appropriate moments.
I wish I was there. This is the part. This is like the only part of the story that like me as a person, like I feel like jealous of. I'm just like I wanted to be there when all these like posh people were there, and instead of Beethoven, they were treated to a guy reading his own poetry while a toilet flushed at random moments, and a bunch of these like instruments.
Oh, absolutely. And there are some renditions out there that I've found after the fact. Unfortunately, no firsthand recordings of this exist, but the people who have kind of recreated some of it from recordings at the time of the press, they're immaculate because it's like it's Dryberg screaming through a megaphone, "Woe is me, my language is dying," as like typewriters clack away furiously, the string section swells, two pianists on the same piano are banging out Stravinsky, toilets are flushing, people are screaming, the audience is losing their shit because they're like, what have we walked into? It's perfect.
And Crowley hears about this and is like, oh yes.
Oh yes. He was like, bring him to me in Paris. So Crowley invited him to Paris, and Driberg explicitly stating one of my primary motivations for why I do magic as hard as I do, which is to have a weird fucking life, accepted the invitation. And from Driberg's diary entry of the day, he says the following.
Crowley was already there when I got to the Eiffel Tower. He stood up, stout, bold, and middle-aged, in a well-cut +4 suit of green hand-woven tweed, and greeted me. Then, as we sat down, he said in a rather high, cracked, and donnish voice,
"Pardon me while I invoke the moon."
That we...
I think we're just not gonna even try to re-record any of these quotes. We're just gonna go exactly as they go the first time around.
We did not, on this occasion, go into these deeper matters. I asked him whether at this time he was performing any magical ceremonies in London. He took the opportunity to explain that they were very expensive to set up. The pentacle must be just so, etc. Or it could be dangerous. All the same, a lot of rubbish had been written about his magic. Magic was simply the art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. It operated in quite everyday ways. When you used the telephone, it was magic, or would have been thought so a century ago.
So, after this meeting in Paris, Crowley and Driberg both remained pretty fascinated with each other. There's some speculation by, contemporary scholars and biographers of both of them that the motivation behind this was actually that Crowley thought that Driberg was pretty wealthy at the time, which by other accounts was definitely not the case. Driberg actually shortly thereafter entered a period of pretty abject poverty, which we'll get into. But Driberg, through his charisma and through his willingness to indulge Crowley's antics, kind of strung him along, and they actually retained a well recorded and well archived collection of correspondence between the two of them. Another set of this is as follows.
One day, Crowley wrote to tell me that he had found a reference to myself in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The actual quote was, "From no expected house shall this child come." And "What house?" asked Crowley. "Could be more expected than Aedes Christi, Christ Church, the house." It was hard to tell if he was serious or joking. as when soon after this he told me that he decided to nominate me as his successor as world teacher. He had assumed this role for some years and dated all his letters from the year and day of this epiphany.
So to get into that more specifically, Driberg actually began a pretty extensive correspondence with a lot of the people involved in kind of the Thelemite and, pseudo-Gnostic and like OTO, barring dates. I'm not super a scholar of the exact timeline of any of these orders. But he, became involved, shall we say, attending dinner parties of members, interacting with Crowley, interacting with higher ups in the AA and the OTO, and all this stuff. And he got his hands through a scenario. I don't even know what else to call it, but like a few years after the events of the quote that Salt just read, where he visited Crowley in England, Driberg got his hands on like a treasure chest, like a literal trunk of Crowley's handwritten letters, journals, magic records, all the stuff, this, very rare, very valuable Thelemite material, like firsthand accounts of Crowley's day-to-days going on from a stage magician and illusionist named the Great Cosmo, who himself claimed that he obtained this chest of materia through either payment in lieu of rent or in the course of a moonlight flit. So I think Driberg does the best job of explaining it out of anyone, which is the following quote.
I went along to see Cosmo. The letters were not compromising, but I relieved him of them. He also let me have something much more interesting, a small square volume, bound in red morocco and encased in Baroque silver, which must once have held a missal or breviary. This contained Crowley's manuscript diary, recording his daily magical and sexual doings for the period covering Loveday's death at Cefalù and Mussolini's subsequent expulsion of Crowley from Italy. He set up another temple in Tunis. It also contained a number of pages bearing what may be called oaths of allegiance, signed in Crowley's presence by various devotees.
So there are a couple interesting things that are actually revealed by Driberg's possession of this particular journal, which, namely is the ranking and involvement of various historical figures within, Thelema and in the order, and having directly interacted with Crowley, in addition to, various connections to other historical occultists, as it were. Like there was correspondence with Pamela Coleman Smith, of course, the illustrator of the Rider-Waite Smith tarot deck that we all see to this day, and all this other interesting stuff. And the specific journal that he mentions, the red Morocco encased in Baroque silver, is the vehicle by which Driberg plays a really elaborate prank on Crowley that actually fleeces Crowley out of a fair bit of like money and resources during a dinner party that Driberg attended with a bunch of other Thelemites and magicians at the time. Notably to me, Lady Freda Harris was in attendance at this dinner, who is the illustrator of the Thoth tarot deck, who is also happens to be the wife of Driberg's colleague at the time, who is the Liberal Party's chief whip, Sir Percy Harris. Another fucking weirdo, who was the, politician at the time. But Freda Harris herself was a really competent diviner by way of the I Ching, and was initiated directly into the fourth degree of the OTO because of her initiations already existing along with her husband into Freemasonry and co-Freemasonry, respectively. But this prank, Driberg pulled the fucking wool over Crowley's eyes and pretended to scry the appearance and the contents of the journal in a crystal and like apparatus that Crowley had prepared for him to scry into at this party. And the quote is as follows.
Then Crowley did what he had done often before. He drew a little diagram known as the pentacle used for telling fortunes by the ancient Egyptians, and asked me to stare into the central space between the lines and tell him what I could see. I had never before seen or pretended to see anything, but now I recalled the little manuscript diary which he did not know that I had, and began, in a trance-like voice, to describe it. The shining Baroque silver, a monstrance with a host on one side of it, the red leather, the writing inside which I could not quite read. I'd never seen Crowley so staggered. He leaned forward in desperate eagerness.
Go on.
He said.
Go on.
But the vision faded.
Try again.
He pleaded. No, I said. I can't see anything more. Though perhaps if we had another bottle of Moet. This was, I fear, a rather mean trick to play on the old boy. I excused it to myself by reflecting that it had given him such obvious amazed delight to see one of his own bits of magic actually coming true.
Wow, that is... Oh, Driberg, you are a saucy boy for getting one up on Crowley like that and pretending that you were scrying when you were actually just remembering that you actually owned the book.
Yeah, it's a pretty spicy trick to play, and just to be like, give me another bottle of wine, maybe I'll scry it for you. So I imagine, Lady Harris standing alongside, just fucking giggling along, being like, this is good. Because she was, by all accounts, pretty fucking psychic herself. So hopefully she understood what was happening and had a good deal of fun with it.
Yeah, I hope that she was scrying Driberg, saw that he was not scrying, and then just laughed to herself and let it happen. That's like my fanfic version of this event, like what I hope happened in my head.
That's definitely mine as well, having snubbed her for world teacher.
Yeah, literally. Like the Gnostic saints, and there's just no women,
Yeah, exactly. Where's the women? It's a deeper mystery. Okay, where's the deeper mystery? You'll get to it eventually. Bottom text. Well, here's your deeper mystery. Hopefully she scried it and laughed at fucking Curly. So to add a final piece of purely Dribergian flair to this Crowley arc, this particular journal and the other letters and notebooks that were contained within this trunk that he got from the great Cosmo, presumably by fucking him, were eventually sold at great cost to Jimmy Page by Driberg. And this is the same, Jimmy Page isn't the guitarist for Led Zeppelin. And he also, out of this trunk, took a personalized copy of the Book of the Law and sold it for what Driberg describes as a great sum. And in the biography, Driberg actually makes a pretty good fucking point to say, yeah, I fucking fleeced Crowley for like all he's worth and made a really good amount of money off of our friendship. So, take that as you will.
Oh, Crowley, you were a naughty boy. You should have scried him better, but I think it seems like he was just very into him.
Oh yeah,
and was a little blinded by the haze, if you will.
Given both of their, sexual predilections, I would not be surprised if Crowley was fucking all over Mr. Driberg. So throughout this whole time, to return to the, more mundane life of Mr. Driberg, is he's doing like leftist organizing, doing a bunch of like crazy, like hardcore anti-fascist and communist stuff, which based. So he formed the Oxford University Communist Party in 1926 and was almost immediately following arrested for distributing pamphlets that encouraged the strike of 1926 that occurred in the UK. and other, red journals, as he described them previously, that his teachers and headmasters took with a grain of salt. But he was still publishing them, and it was still illegal. So he was, in fact, arrested and subsequently freed from prison due to an incredibly lucky break in which he's just like, I'm Tom Driberg. And they're like, greetings, Tom Driberg. You are free from jail now.
God, this is one of the things. Like, he's like a leftist organizer, but he's also a posh boy. So he just, he gets a certain amount of privilege that his fellow compatriots and comrades do not.
Yeah, there's like a really, to go back to the earlier point that keeps coming back time and time again in this episode, there's a unique contradiction to everything that he does in his life with everything else he does in his life. Where like he was definitely, a bourgeois Oxford student at the time on a full scholarship, came from an estate of family money, which will turn out to actually not really be that much money. We'll get into that. And he just like was hanging out at these, as we'll later come to learn, going to these high society dinner parties of the who's who of London, hanging out with them, getting absolutely trashed on like free opulent money, going home and writing gossip columns about them as what he framed as an exercise in class struggle to knock the bourgeois down like a number of pegs. And he's just a fucking weirdo because he like reconciled all this perfectly within himself. Throughout all of this, he's doing his like bourgeois communism, facilitating the contradiction, and also, of course, to match the third lens of his life, was fucking everyone under the sun, going out every night cottaging, cruising with what he described as working class men around Oxford, and himself refusing to sleep with other Oxford students, also as an exercise in class struggle, because he felt it was only appropriate to sleep with proletariat men.
There's layers to that I don't even know if I want to poke at with a stick right now, but Tom, you're a posh boy.
I highly recommend the podcast Bad Gays, because they do a good biography on Tom Driberg that, of course, does not go at it from the occult angle that we are, but really gets into his, class in conjunction with his homosexuality and his sexual practices that do a much more comprehensive explanation and breakdown of everything going on there. And I will pawn our listeners off onto them because they definitely deserve the listener base.
For sure. I had a fun time listening to that one when we discovered it.
Oh yeah. To speak of bad gays, Tom Driberg dropped out of Oxford in 1927, having foregone his academics to do all the crazy shit we just talked about. Reading The Wasteland and going to poetry slams is not the most effective thing to completing an undergraduate education, as I myself learned firsthand. So after he drops out, he hangs out around, various artist districts and quarters in Oxford. At one point, there's this whole arc in his autobiography that, like, I don't even know what to say. He worked as the front desk man in a bar/inn that also was a brothel on the second floor. It's just fucking, it's a whole thing. I highly recommend reading his biography for this part of his life. It's very explicit and bizarre and indulges a lot of fetishes around the time. So coming out of the squalor, he is still going to Edith Sitwell's salons and hang out with all these authors, and she saves his ass again.
It's like Meaton's finger.
No, no, maybe.
Bad ideas. It's so
I,
enticing.
I love your bad ideas. I just recommend that you keep them to the realm of ideas.
I love you.
I love you too. Sorry, can you continue?
Yeah, so upon hearing that Driberg dropped out of Oxford, Sitwell uh, decides to hook him up with a job, knowing how much that he knows about the nightlife and the goings on of the elite in the area. Pawns him off to the Daily Express and Lord Beaverbrook as a gossip columnist, where after a brief and pretty fraught initial period, he begins to write a successful gossip column that also regularly featured avant-garde artistic endeavors that he was still involved with, and became, known under the pseudonym that he was playing around with at the time, William Hickey. So Lord Beaverbrook, a man who probably deserves a biographical episode all his own in a different podcast, because this guy's not an occultist, but Driver definitely fucking was. Um, he's the proprietor of the Daily Express in England. He developed a huge respect for Driberg for his, out and loud antics in the 30s at this point, going kind of wild with his life and living this very bohemian lifestyle, but also keeping careful record of his contradictions inherent to his being among, his left-wing politics that he was being pretty hardcore involved with at the time in England, trying to set up the Communist Party there, going about these other artistic endeavors, fucking around with all this other crazy shit. And during this time, Beaverbrook kind of kicks a project to Driberg that Driberg embraces with absolute vigor, that is about the American evangelist Frank Buchman, as well as the two groups that Buchman founded called the Moral Rearmament and the Oxford Group, which most famously evolved into a book that Driberg wrote called The Mystery of the Moral Rearmament. These guys, I just want to touch on them briefly because of how much of an outsized influence on contemporary, kind of puritanical ideology they have to this day, and their outsized influence in different organizations. But Dryberg noticed this and was like roasting them from the time of the late 30s.
Yeah, they had their own like 6 degrees thing going on that we discovered as we started like our little conspiracy chart of like a red string on like the cork board.
Yeah, so like exactly that, tracing the intellectual and, ideological influence of these people. They are the ones who actually went on to develop the 12 steps that are endemic to Alcoholics Anonymous, and the idea of like a 12-step recovery program, which itself was kind of created when Carl Jung inspired Roland Hazard to look for like spiritual solutions to alcoholism by sending him to this very Oxford group that we've kind of mentioned, and linking Tom Driberg by 2 degrees of separation to Carl Jung. And they will probably come up again in later episodes due to like Svinga and I's interest in like post-Yugoslav anti-fascist movements.
Woo!
Woo!
That is indeed a niche interest, which I got you in on. Once you learn a post-Yugoslav language, if you will,
yeah,
I'm gonna show you the real world.
Woo!
We'll see how deep that rabbit hole goes.
But yeah, it's a bunch of crazy stuff there. It's a very deep rabbit hole, as you just said. Just teasing it out, their connections with JBS and Christian Identity and all these very far right-wing groups that Dryberg was, in my opinion, rightfully roasting the fuck out of them for the last 80 years. So Dryberg during this period becomes like a quote unquote more serious reporter at the behest of Beaverbrook, because Beaverbrook is like, why do you know everyone and know everything? So he starts reporting extensively about, class struggle and writing through this Marxist communist lens. He traveled extensively as an embedded reporter, twice covering the Spanish Civil War, where he was noted for his like frontline physical bravery, where he would just like run through like trenches and shit and like be shot at and just not really care. He traveled extensively throughout pre-war Nazi Germany, exploring, that fomenting political ideology for better or for worse. His, coverage of the coronation of Pius XII, who later also went on to run the rat lines and was kind of Hitler's pope, which is some crazy stuff. He was like doing some high tier political reporting at the time in the 1938, 1939. Covered the New York's World's Fair in 39, and this kind of feeds into his extensive travels, where during his embedding with the various soldiers at the time, he was absolutely fucking all of them, which is really funny. There are stories where he was actually arrested multiple times during this period due to his homosexuality, but literally every single time, Lord Beaverbrook paid off everyone involved to win Driberg's freedom because he was that good of a reporter for him. So
everyone says be gay, do crime until someone actually does it.
Oh yeah. And this guy was like, fuck it, I do crime. Gay is crime, let's go.
It was indeed, unfortunately, at this time period.
So during this period, to make a resurgence of these certified freak Maxwell Knights, they kind of met up, started hanging out, and Maxwell Knight was an intelligence officer who rapidly ascended to director of intelligence at MI5. He was a spy handler doing a bunch of crazy shit. He was involved with the OTO, Thelema, and like the AA pretty extensively. And this is really weird to me on like a personal aside, that he was like a pretty hardcore avowed fascist and like anti-Semite, himself joining up with the British fascisti as early as 1924. He like, and it's weird because he also like denounced his involvement later on as like an intelligence gathering operation at the behest of MI5, but at the same time he was known to like literally everyone in his life, including his spouses, plural, because he was divorced and remarried multiple times, as like a hardcore fascist and anti-Semite, but like was still Driberg's friend somehow. Just a very bizarre guy who later also became like an anti-communist, but kind of a third positionist in his maintained fascist proclivities. It's a whole thing. But Driberg just hung out with him because he's like, this guy is a fucking occultist and I like him because he makes me get away with spies and shit. There are some rumors as well that I want to briefly touch on, that Joan Miller, who was a woman who was a MI5 agent under the direction of Maxwell Knight and Knight's close personal friend, speculated that Knight was a closeted homosexual with interest in Driberg romantically, and kind of came to this conclusion because Knight confided in her allegedly that he didn't consummate any of his first 3 marriages that dissolved, presumably for related reasons.
Interesting.
One of Knight's biographers, as recently as 2017, actually pretty significantly contests this claim, but he kind of disregards her testimony on the matter, so it's all up in the air. This guy was like, the meme, I'm a certified infiltrator, I just infiltrate movements, I don't even know what my ideology is as long as I'm infiltrating.
Yeah. The 30-something-year-old infiltrator.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So, yeah, he maybe turned Driberg into an MI5 agent. This is an allegation that only surfaced posthumously to Driberg. It's difficult to corroborate this, though, because a lot of sources said that they kept him kind of at arm's length from sensitive intelligence because he was a known gossip and would just let shit leak in order to make romantic advances on people. Um,
The soul of indiscretion.
exactly. So around the same time, this is when his mother passes away. To go back to the much earlier point about her, certified queen for having bee pacts posthumously and apparating physically. So he used the inheritance from her estate to kind of break himself out of poverty, but not really, because he was really shit at handling money by all accounts, to finance a mortgage for the estate Bradwell Juxtamarais, which would lead to his lordship later on and his ability to actually, join the House of Lords and have the title of Baron Bradwell throughout his lifetime. One of the other things about this estate, though, is that it led to him getting married to a woman. Here's where we say that Tom Driver, despite being a king, is problematic. TM. So much to the shock of every single person involved, he announced that he would be marrying his friend Ina Binfield, who is a Suffolk County councilor and a political ally of his. Everyone was like, what the fuck are you talking about? You're super gay, and everyone knows you're super gay. And he's like, yes, and of course that will lead to issues, as happened on their wedding night. Their wedding, by the way, extravagant high Anglican ceremony where multiple people were evacuated from the church because of how much incense was burned. And at this wedding as well, possibly goals is they played the Labor Party anthem, The Red Flag, around which the communists were organizing at the time, instead of a more conventional, like Here Comes the Bride.
Oh my god.
See, Anglican, socialist, he hits the right notes.
Yeah, so Francis Wheen, the other biographer that we mentioned earlier, described the ceremony by all accounts as outrageously ornate. So Driberg himself was shocked at the request that Ida made to share a hotel room and consummate their marriage on their honeymoon, which he understandably did not want to do, having himself booked 2 separate rooms after their wedding, and called in male prostitutes, but that's beside the point.
Oh god, this poor woman already.
Yeah, so we're gonna get into how fucking horribly he treated her in a second. So she hated him after 10 years of this miserable marriage where he was known to be, a certified dickhead to her and be constantly leaving the house to hook up with men and cheat on her pretty openly with these random younger guys, and be flaunting his blatantly, extravagant sex life in front of her with only men. And she's like, you know what, fuck you. Eventually she wrote a pretty strongly worded series of letters to him, where she said, I have tried for 10 years to make a compromise with you in your extraordinary mode of life and have now given up. Yeah, so
I think it's really sad that he basically abused her and used her as a glorified maid, because obviously she was aware that this was never going to be anything but a marriage of convenience for the both of them. but he didn't have to like treat her as a domestic slave. Like, it's kind of sad that
Yeah.
he's like a revolutionary in this way, and then when it comes to like, this woman who's so close to him and who's a friend, he's just like, well, time to be a completely conventional man about this. It's like, oh, I'm a revolutionary, but misogyny, that's a-okay. Since when do
Literally,
as,
yeah.
as like since when do women have class consciousness? And then you get to like Marx and Engels being like very explicitly extolling the importance of understanding all of that, and they're like, I read over that part, but I didn't notice that.
Legit, yeah.
Oh, Tom.
Yeah, it's pretty fucked up. I definitely defer listeners to Bad Gays, the podcast again, because as the name suggests, they explain why he was kind of a piece of shit for how he treated Ina and how he treated the various, younger male prostitutes that he hired throughout his life and went cruising with at cottages throughout England.
Mm-hmm.
And that is beyond the scope of this, but for just the sake of saying it, definitely recommend doing your own research, reading, listening, what have you, on that particular subject matter before starting this up, because he was up to some pretty weird shit throughout his life. But yeah, speaking of weird shit, there's this other factor of their life that I think we would be remiss to not mention, which is his intimate involvement with the Cray brothers. So if you've heard anything about the history of crime in London, you've doubtless heard of the Cray twins, Ronnie and Reggie. These guys were notorious gangsters. They were involved in, murder, racketeering, armed robbery, arson, gambling, assaults, you name it, they did it. They owned a bunch of nightclubs in which they hung out with politicians and socialites, including Frank Sinatra, Judy Garland, and themselves became celebrities as these, club owning crime lords who had literal impunity from the law.
It was actually Salt who kind of pointed out to me just how big the Krays were, because I hadn't really heard of them, but he was the one who kind of mentioned, yeah, if you know anything about, like as you said, like crime in London, like you'll know about these identical twins and all the crazy stuff they got up to.
Yeah, I mean, they're basically like, kind of our equivalent to Al Capone in terms of like fame and just how deep their influence was. Like, politicians, the youths on the streets, like everyone knew who they were, and everyone was either in their pocket or looking to work with them. Like, they're just big
Yeah.
men.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, even though we don't have the time to go into like the craze themselves, their lives have been extensively documented, through films, biographies. I should note multiple autobiographies. Reggie has two, Ronnie has one. They have one together. And then there's one that their older brother wrote about. I think it only dawned on me recently while reading into them that they had an older brother. But it's literally mostly about them, and he even titles it "Me and My Brothers," just to give you a hint as to who was really famous there. But yeah, so there's plenty of Cray twins content out there for those interested. We even watched a few movies actually to kind of get ourselves warmed up to the idea.
And the reason we even invoke the Cray connection in the first place is that they were famous for throwing some pretty lavish gay orgies. Specifically Ronnie, who wasn't really in the closet, much like Driberg, referring to himself at various points in his life as bisexual, and then later exclusively as homosexual, most famously proclaiming himself, much like myself, I'm not a fucking poof, I'm a homosexual.
Oh my god. Some hardcore top posting.
Oh yeah.
Is there like a clip from like the Tom Hardy movie that we watched? Like we saw both of them, right? We saw like there's a few Cray movies, but like we saw in 1991 just called The Krays, and it's starring Gary Kemp as Ronnie and Martin Kemp as Reggie. It's like the only one where there's actually identical twins who play them. And then we saw Legend from 2015 starring Tom Hardy as both Reggie and Ronnie, and he does Ronnie in the Bane voice, by the way. Very, very just, for you. Very, very good performance. But there was a clip, right, in which he gets introduced with his boy toy, Mad Teddy Smith, who was his associate and lover. And he crawls out of the love list. And there's literally like a time in that movie where he basically says what you just said.
Yeah, Ronnie looks over at Reggie's girlfriend and is like, "I'm a homosexual, Francis. I'm a giver. I'm not a receiver. There's a difference."
Oh God, yeah. Something. This is Sparta.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Ronnie Cray liked to be known as a tough guy. He explicitly identified himself with Lawrence of Arabia, all manner of icons of British imperialism. And, this was part of his own assertion of his masculinity, I suppose, that included such formulations of his preferences. So my question to Yuki is, what was Ronnie Cray's Grindr profile like?
Oh man, his Grindr profile is probably like, discreet nightclub owner, Dom Top. I don't host.
But he owns a nightclub, but he doesn't host. Oh God.
Oh man. Yeah, so to avoid the risk of like popping off about the craze for an hour on top of the hour we've already done, to get to the Driberg connection, Driberg was like a friend of the craze in the way he was friends with everyone. For the purpose of both blackmail and personal indulgence, Ronnie Cray would host these like gay orgies of, inviting both the upper class, bourgeois gay men of London high society, parliamentarians, the who's who, and also bring in like these working class, like I guess rent boys, like prostitutes as it were. And Driberg, given his proclivities, was always there tearing shit up, especially and specifically Ronnie Cray's personal boy toy, who Tom Driberg took quite a fancy to.
That is so bold that he was offered his share of partying with them, and he's like, actually, I'm interested in like your boyfriend or whatever, and like Teddy Smith it was. Yeah, that's pretty bold. Is that, because this guy is like a crime boss who just kills people, and he was like, I want your lover.
And
he got away with it.
Yeah.
Remarkable. Like, just like the constant pattern of getting away with it.
Yeah, it's a pretty fucking wild ride. He's like, he needed the blackmail, so he's like, fuck it, fine, like, do what you gotta do. But Driberg is pretty bold for that one. So after this kind of happened, the tabloid The Sunday Mirror ran an expose insinuating that Ronnie was in a relationship with the conservative whip, Lord Boothby, who had been photographed at one of these orgies. And it, of course, it's important to note that at this time, sex between men was a criminal offense in the UK. So Scotland Yard leaked the picture of Ronnie and Boothby together with Boothby's chauffeur and Teddy Smith, the fucking boyfriend that we were talking about, that Driberg scooped up for himself at these parties. And the photos weren't actually printed, but they were still in possession of the journal. And that was enough to have the twins threaten the journalists involved, and for Boothby himself to start some pretty substantial legal proceedings against the newspaper for slander, which were successful by their use of the political connections and the threat of violence against everyone involved from the Cray brothers, such that the Sunday Mirror issued a retraction. They sacked the editor. They printed an apology. and they paid Boothby a £40,000 out of court settlement in 1960s money, which is about £1 million by like today's money, if not a little more.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Given that, everything that happened was on photograph and was actually true.
Mhm.
So Boothby claimed to have given the settlement money primarily to charity, but it turned out most of it went to the Krays as protection money.
Not a surprise. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of their MO.
Oh yeah. So after this point, other newspapers became unwilling to publish anything about the Krays' connections and criminality. As a result, Conservative Party, because of Boothby's prominent position as the whip, refused to press the police to investigate the Krays, and for over fear that the Boothby connection would again be publicized and lead to legal issues for everyone involved. And the Labour Party, because they thought they could get a win over the Tories on the basis of like this whole scandal, would later come to find out that Driberg was in the same pictures and was frequenting these orgies constantly, and himself, sleeping with Ronnie Kray's boyfriend.
Mind-boggling. Like literally, both the Labour and the Conservative parties were in the double bind of being like, if they out each other, they also out themselves as having their guys there. This scene was in Legend, the 2015 movie with Tom Hardy as Ronnie and Reggie. By the way, Taron Egerton is Mad Teddy Smith in a great casting choice. And like I said, Tom Hardy does the Bane voice for Ronnie, which makes it worth watching just on its own. It features this very story with Driberg in one of the scenes where they even say like, "Oh my God, that's Tom Driberg, isn't it?" And they realize like they can't print this because it would incriminate the Labour Party as well. So that's Driberg. Thank you for telling us about him. I did not know he existed until you made me scry him, and hopefully my scrying was more impressive than his fake scrying to Crowley.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So, contradictions being what they are, there is no doubt that Driberg pursued each of his identities with, a sincerity, as it were. He was a leftist despite also being basically bourgeois himself, and very much leveraging that privilege over a lot of these working class boys he was hooking up with. Then that he was, gay, but also very happily committed to his church proclivities. Not to say that those things, obviously can't coexist, but just to say that, people in his life noticed this and were a little bit like shocked at times. And he was also a politician and a gossip columnist, very much the soul of indiscretion. I love quoting the title of that biography. So tell us, what is a necromancy of Tom Driberg? Like, what are the magical lessons here to learn other than do road openers and luck drawing rituals until you get absolutely everything you want and get away with absolutely all the consequences that could happen?
Yeah, so I was gonna, I guess, start there with he is a really good example of, even as like as we say, quote unquote normie, like someone who wasn't explicitly doing magic, contested claim given his life and everything we got into there. But he's an example of how much you can get away with, doing glamours, doing invisibility magic, doing charming, doing domination on people to win in everything, to live exactly the life he wanted. There, as was pointed out by a lot of his biographers, he's not a tragic figure. He lived a very fulfilling life by his own admission. And went into all of this peculiarity and idiosyncrasy with reckless abandon and loved every second of it. At which gets to the other point, drawing the life that you want to you, that will be satisfying and fun, that will lead you to what you thought is beyond your own dreams, and allowing yourself to be like a social contradiction in that, and just saying fuck it, I can get away with it. I don't give a shit. Being bold in your own enchantment. And I think that that's really the key to the necromancy of Driberg. It's the
The key to the volume of Driberg.
Yeah, exactly. It's the the ruling passions, which he titled his own autobiography. It's the reconciliation of his three ruling passions that ruled his life.
Mm-hmm.
The
That's
love
really beautiful,
Mhm.
honestly, in its own way. Just that, pursuing your joy, As much as we've giggled throughout this episode, I do think that and as much as, in some ways he was quite a villain in the life of his wife, and in the way that he, unfortunately, the Bad Gays podcast is a really good, as you mentioned, like analysis of some of the more difficult parts of, his relationship with class. But I would say that, despite those things, if there's something to learn, in the way that, like, you may not know the intimate life of the soldier whose dirt you purchase, in order to do something that involves the obedience of a soldier in magic. But in terms of the grave dirt of Driberg, which is our, hypothetical object, of the art today, there's something there about being kind of like unashamed of being exactly who you are, hopefully having some more capacity for self-reflection upon some of those contradictions, specifically with regards to like the way he treated his wife, and the way that he leveraged his position and his power and money over a lot of these younger men that he was hooking up with. But I would say, above all, it's to use magic to allow yourself in some ways to be a contradiction, hopefully, in a way that doesn't harm others, right? I would say, be exactly who you are, in all the ways that you are. And, I think that is a good, happy Pride message for the episode.
Definitely, yeah. Be coming out in, middle of June.
Mm-hmm.
Go throw some bricks at windows, do some Stonewall shit. Hope Necromancer Driberg and have his legendary ability to escape the law.
Oh my God, could you
Allow
imagine
you to
the
escape
law
the
stay
law.
away shit you could get up with him? There was,
Oh, yeah.
oh, can you remind me? There was a thing where he got stopped with like a politician from, was it Finland or something?
Okay, so he was it wasn't a politician, it was a dock worker.
Oh, okay,
Given
okay.
his predilection for the proletariat.
Oh God.
So
No comment. Continue.
So he got caught with a Norwegian sailor during the war by a police officer, as Driver described in his autobiography, wet-handed.
Okay.
Which is, kind of a gross way to put it, but his autobiography, of course, full of explicit details.
Driberg or Wetberg?
In that moment, he was Wetberg.
Oh yeah. So Wetberg went up to the cop and was like, "Hey, can we talk about this?" And the cop is like, "What do you want to talk about?" And Driberg gave him a fake name of another parliamentarian and then said, "I'm actually William Hickey," which is his like journalistic pseudonym. And the cop was a fan of his gossip column.
Oh my
God. So he's
God.
like, "Oh, you're William Hickey. Oh, you're William Hickey." And let him go. And they maintained a correspondence for 20 years.
Him and the cop?
Him and the cop, yeah.
Insane. Look, this, okay. When are we getting the dirt? I guess next time we all go to England to visit Salt's family.
Definitely, yeah.
We'll get it. We'll get a car. We'll go.
Yeah, we gotta get to this point. We gotta get his dirt, and continuing the trend. Put your mom on the phone. Put your bewitched mom on the phone.
I need to talk to his bewitched mom. Yes, exactly. We'll get her in there too. Yes. Wow, that is another level of luck.
Oh yeah.
So what are your thoughts on the on the Anglican side of things?
I think Anglicanism today is a lot more socially progressive than most forms of Christianity that are kind of, as far as larger denominations, it's a little bit more progressive than you'll find in Catholic and more Americanized Protestant varieties. But it's still, Christian is still somewhat socially conservative, and so I find his eagerness to bring these two things together, right? His sexuality and his Anglican faith together. It's very fascinating and honestly very respectable.
There was a whole thing, if I'm recalling it correctly, where he like lectured in a school about Anglican theology and like boasted in such a cool way actually that like he could perfectly reconcile these things using the theology, which I mean I absolutely love.
He did, yeah. After his education at Oxford and kind of around this period when he was familiarizing himself intimately with high Anglican doctrine and the positions of the church on various social and political phenomena, he had notably coherent arguments in favor of the permissibility of socially liberal positions from the church, a permittance of homosexuality, permittance of various other, socially progressive issues at the time, integration of the churches, allowing women to have greater roles, all this other, stuff, and which is pretty cool. He also had, interestingly enough, a very theologically sound argument for the permissibility of cannabis.
Mm.
And even before the Second World War, was arguing in favor of decriminalization of smoking cannabis,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of cool.
Very cool, yeah. So I have a stupid question. You gave us Ronnie Craze. What is Driberg's grinder?
Driberg's grinder. I don't know if I can say it on this platform.
Okay, never mind.
It's
We'll
probably
DM it to me later.
yeah. It's like no profile picture is like an uncomfortably close distance from you. And
it's William Hickey instead, like the pseudonym.
Yeah, and it has some particularly uncomfortable message in the bio about how he wants to like suck dick right now.
I love the description of the profile image, uncomfortably. Yeah.
It's like under like 500 meters. It's like, what the fuck?
Yeah, why is he so close? I ask because literally I feel like he would have torn shit up like in the age of social media, because he would have had a gossip column everywhere. He would have probably in a like a link tree included like all his other identities and stuff like that, like completely comfortably linking them together, like he would have been a riot. Well, there you have it. Do you have any other thoughts? I mean, I think the occult angle aside, I know we've mentioned him a lot, but like Bad Gaze does a really good job, especially with some of like the more uncomfortable aspects of his life and some of the things that come up when you Google him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I really want to defer to their analysis of the more problematic things in his life. He was dogged by, perhaps rightfully so, by accusations of various, misdeeds throughout his life that they really get into the weeds about, contextualize them historically, analyze the biographers who first levied the accusations, do all this, really diligent deep dive into it. And, because he was arrested multiple times for sodomy and, as it was called, corrupting the youth.
Yeah, ironically, a very Socratean, if you will, crime to be arrested for.
Yeah, right.
Perhaps you could say both, but it is what it is. Specifically, obviously, corrupting the youth. It was that and making up false gods. That got Socrates thrown in the slammer. So I would say that it's just important to note that they do a really good job of analyzing the nuances behind these accusations, and specifically, like, are they credible? Probably not, but yeah, they do a great job. So definitely check them out, and check out our Akashic records. For mine is London Calling by The Clash. That's all I listen to while looking into the research you were throwing my way.
And Gentlemen, my Akashic record of the day is Tear You Apart by She Wants Revenge.
The key ASMR voice. People are gonna want that, like, for a Patreon perk, is like a re-recording of aspects of our episodes, but it's just your ASMR voice. Daddy's home.
ASMR, you've been a very naughty demon, and I'm going to exorcise you to the deepest pits of hell.
Yeah, I think we could.
Oh man,
that's probably very financially tenable. And speaking of which, patreon.com/The Frightful Howls is the best way you can support us to put out more content. We just released our first bonus, Q&A episode, which was quite a riot. You guys sent in some really funny questions. Thank you so much. So if you'd like to hear that and get access to Salt's amazing almanac, daily, prescriptions on what to do, what not to do, what kind of magic is best done on this day, what are the astrological conditions for them, what are some fun charms to do, what did a spirit whisper into his ear when he was writing that page. You will never see anything like it. Check it out at patreon.com/The Frightful Howls. And we also have our show notes where you get to see all our research and references that we made. And at the end of the almanac, you get your little plant of the month cheat sheet. And you also get to, just be part of our community where you can give us suggestions for future episodes, ask us questions, and participate. So thank you all so much for your help. For your support. Getting your comments on Instagram, on Twitter, and especially in my DMs, it seems to be the main place people send me things, has been overwhelming. We are so happy that you guys enjoy these. And this episode was a little brief, intermission between all the folklore heavy episodes to look into a very funny gentleman. Next up, we have quite a treat for you. We're back on the folklore train and onto some explicit saint magic, but not with a saint that you expect. So we're very, very excited for that one. And Key, do you have License to Depart?
I do.
Are you gonna read it in the daddy voice?
What do you think? Should I?
That could be a Patreon perk. A compilation of Key's Licenses to Depart, read because you've been a very naughty demon. I can't do it. Honestly, I can do accents. I can't do that. That's okay. I can forfeit the demon daddy title. And honestly, shout outs to Salt for powering through this episode. Just being bewildered that the craze and every other guy he's ever heard of is linked to him.
Insane. Like, this man just has a network. The layers.
Literally. From now on, we should play a 6 Degrees of Tom Driberg game whenever we mention, I don't want to overcommit us to that gimmick, but like at some point we're going to have to be like, okay, and guess what? Episode 4, he's linked to Tom Driberg in this way. Because even Led Zeppelin, everything, yeah, he's pretty crazy. I remember talking about it with Salt privately. I was like making dinner for us, and he just commented to me. He was just like, all the who's who of England at the time are connected to this guy, as well as beyond it. So that is some solar pentacle under the breast mechanics if I've ever seen one. Not that he needed it, because it's probably inherent in his birth chart, which one day Salt will have, and then it will all be over.
If any listener is able to find his birth time, please do send it into the show. Somehow get it to us, because we really want that information.
I will say, as far as the day, there's a Mercury-Mars opposition, and that just makes so much sense for anyone who knows the traditional signification of that.
All right, give it to us, Key. Let's depart.
Yeah. Let us depart into the night. So the license to depart today comes to you from the Grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet. Get you to the place predestined, which our Lord Jesus Christ hath ordained for you, until I call you again under pain of damnation. And I do conjure you that when I shall call you again, either in the house or in the field, in the night or in the day, or at any time or in any place, I conjure you suddenly to appear in obtaining the blessing